Welcome, everybody. This is a great turnout. We're delighted to have had such a good response to our event. This is a collaborative event, collaborative in many ways. It's a collaboration between libraries and arts. We're all working in different ways and formats, as you know now, so it's great to be able to come together, albeit on screen. We're very pleased to have Manchán here and to get the chance to celebrate his book, which is doing extraordinarily well. We had a conversation beforehand. I think it was everybody's Christmas present of choice. Thank you for that, Manchán. You made a very difficult Christmas present task very easy. And we have Annemarie chatting to Manchán, and Annemarie is a friend of Westmeath's, if we can call you that, Annemarie, because she worked with us on the John Broderick residency a number of years ago in the inaugural year, and we have not let her go since, finding all sorts of ways and excuses to keep bringing her back to Westmeath. Even though we don't doubt your roots in Donegal, Annemarie, we're hanging on to you, as Manchán can testify to. Once you get into Westmeath, it gets into your bones and it's hard to get away. So there's really very little more I need to say except to thank you both very much, and to thank all the people who have come to our event today. Really looking forward to it. I think the housekeeping is done insofar as you need to be on mute, and we're being recorded. And if you want to add your questions to the chat box, please do. We will take questions at the end of the session, all going well and seeing how our timing has run through. So type it in there. If you're not on mute, if I can get you to put your audio on mute, that would be great. So I'll hand over to Annemarie and Manchán and enjoy.
Thank you, Miriam, and welcome everyone. Fáilte Higan Ácid Special Shaw. I'm delighted to be introducing you to our very esteemed guest, Manchán Magan. And Manchán will be no stranger to many of you. He's written books on his travels in Africa, India and South America. He has 2 novels to his name. He writes regularly for the Irish Times and presents the Almanac of Ireland RTE for RTE Radio 1 and reports on travels for various radio programmes. He's presented dozens of documentaries on issues of world culture. But before we go on with the conversation, and you know, I could list Manchán's impressive achievements here all afternoon, but what I really want to say to you before we kick off is that Manchán is an extraordinary mind. He has a uniquely rich perspective on life, and he has this astonishing deep-rooted connection to Irish language and to the world and culture of language. And the first time I met Manchán was at a festival in Meath, I believe, and I was just spellbound by his ability to weave together geography, history, mythology, the other world, and his illuminations on the Irish psyche. So we're here today to talk about Manchán's book, 32 Words for Field. I know you might be seeing this backwards, so I'm afraid there's nothing I could do with that, which in many ways is, I think, a book about seeing. And it's a book that provides a window through which we can pull back the curtains on landscape and language and glimpse chapter by chapter the world of the ancestors and observe the way in which that ancestral world is still available to us. It's a vibrant, hopeful clarion call, I think. And in here, you'll find meditations on the ocean, on witches, on curses, cows, seaweed, and much more. And it's an absolute treasure trove and a must read for anyone who's interested in Irish culture. So Manchán, you're very welcome, and thank you for joining us. And can I just begin by saying that this book has taken Ireland and all lovers of all things Irish by storm. I tried to order this book several times over Christmas until I got hold of it because it was out of print so often. And I want to ask if you were prepared for the appetite and the hunger for a book of this kind at this particular moment?
Thank you so much, Annemarie, for those lovely things you said. And to answer your question, no, like I certainly wasn't. I had been wrestling over this book for 6 years, slowly trying to think about what I wanted to say, like just juggling it around in my head. And draft after draft of the book just did not work, just made no sense whatsoever. And whenever I'd send it to anyone, they'd just say, like, we don't want another book about the language. And I realized I didn't want to talk about the language. I wanted to talk about something far grander than that. How, as you said, language can be this route to get into something far more profound. So eventually, what about a year and a half ago, Gill Books took it on, and they thought, okay, it might do nicely for the Christmas market. We'll do a hardback edition. We'll have a nice graphic on the front of it, but this is going to sell. We'll print about 5,000 copies, and they'll slowly sell over a year. And that's exactly what should have happened. And even I thought, okay, at the end of a year, some people who will have read it who might be interested, and then people would talk about it. But the fact that, you know, it went for sale at the beginning of September, and 4 days later it was sold out. So, and no one had read the book. So it wasn't because the book was good, but it's because we are in this magical time now of reimagining our connection with the land. And like, you know, I ran in 2016 in the general election for the Green Party in Westmeath and Longford. And I battled my head. How could I make people realize that we can actually live in this land, live in this culture, live in this heritage, and live with the psychological legacy and the cultural sort of ghost, the psychic ghost that still exists here in a new way? And it proved too much for a general election. Like some of my hoardings on my stoops or whatever they are with the other candidates were with Robert, that Fianna Fáil man, and whoever else were just farcical. You know, I had these big philosophical ideas that didn't make sense. But ultimately, what I wanted to say is that on this island, we have been living here. People have been living here for 10,000 years. You know, we came along probably 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the descendants, our DNA descendants, but we could have taken words on from those original settlers who arrived here 9,000, 10,000 years ago. And some of those words could still be in our language. And I thought, if I could convey something like that the language not only has these memories of ancient times, but encoded with it has really sustainable ways of living the land. If I could manage to put all that into a book, I would be happy. Probably it would have been ignored, but thank God during COVID, people want to reassess their place in the world and their connection with their environment. So I was very lucky.
It's just a magic time for this book to be coming out, and such a gift to us. In the first few lines of the book, you talk about your grandmother, Sheila Humphreys, who taught you the Irish language. And in my mind, I have this sense of her as this larger than life character, real woman on a mission, a gun running, outlaw, smuggling, badass. You know, she's almost semi-mythical. And I was reminded that so often as grandparents are a key influence for us as writers in terms of giving us permission to explore and to play with story and narratives. So can you tell us more about Sheila's influence on your early life and how she encouraged a love of language in you?
Yeah, that is such a profound question, because, you know, not only, yeah, clearly it's like I hadn't noticed that before, the fact that grandparents are so key to writers, but in fact they're key to everybody's creative side, aren't they? Everybody's imaginative side, everybody's more expansive side. Where our parents were busy, the grandparents had time to nurture us, to spoil us, to have the patience to listen to our endless changing obsessions with whatever it was, whether Lego or, you know, the clouds or the moving trees or kicking a ball. So my grandmother was, as you say, a remarkable figure. Anybody who sounds like a mythic figure, they're often difficult to live with. You know, she was absolutely passionate and determined and single-minded. And so that morning on Easter Monday, 1916, when she saw her beloved uncle, the O'Reilly, go out into 1916, go out to the GPO to face certain death. Like, she was, I mean, I hear from my mum, who knew, you know, her mother and who knew my grandmother's mother, and her grandaunt very well. She had this fire in her from when she was 2 or 3, but, you know, by the age of 16, she was a force to be reckoned with. And when she sees the O'Rahilly, her uncle, go out and die, she devotes herself to learning the Irish language. So not only had she the experience of the O'Rahilly who had brought her to the Blasket Islands when they were, when my granny was about 12 and 13 in 1913, but then she focused it on herself. She became the vice president of Cumann na Mban and made Irish language and history and culture a key element of the Cumann na Mban. And then when my mother came along in 1939, the only language my mother was going to hear was my grandmother. And while my book lauds my granny, my poor mother doesn't get mentioned at all. And she says, I had a role in teaching you Irish too. But of course, the more romantic story is my grandmother. And to be fair, because of my grandmother's forceful personality, because she was telling us stories of the times that she had created a tunnel in Kilmainham jail, a tunnel that can still be seen today in her cell is still in Kilmainham jail. And her graffiti written in both, always in Irish, except the only time she writes her graffiti in English is about the tunnel, because when she leaves, she wants someone else to continue it. That was in about 1923. And in fact, that writing is still there. It just shows that nothing ever goes in Ireland. The legacies, the memories of those elements are still with us. So when I come along in 1970, she just saw me as putty. I was going to be molded and become a little foot soldier for the mission she had. And I mean, I bidably went along with it for a while, but then to escape all of that, I traveled. I went, traveling in Africa and South America and India, and that gave me a new perspective. And I thought, I wonder, could one come at the Irish language from that global cultural perspective?
And so you hitched yourself to a truck as a teenager and you took off and went to Africa, and it seems like you didn't have an entirely easy experience. And I was thinking about how important it is as writers to experience that tension and to put ourselves in discomfort and to look over the horizon line. And I wondered if you'd speak for a moment about what you learned about Ireland by leaving Ireland and what you learned there about language from afar.
Yeah. So, as you said, and again, it is about the writer trying to find his place in the world, but in fact, every young person trying to find their place in the world and not knowing, wondering what is going to find meaning for them. And for me, as you said, I was one of these isolated loners who didn't quite fit in as a young person. So first I went off to Africa, across Africa, then I spent a lot of time in South America, and then I finally made my way up to a cowshed in the Himalayas because everyone I've been meeting in these remote places said, if you really want to find yourself, you need to get to the Himalayas. There's some energy in the rock and the stones there that is going to enlighten you. And unfortunately, I went too far into my own head and into beautiful, mythic, romantic places. And so my mother had to send my brother out to rescue me. At this stage, my grandmother was in a nursing home, and my brother comes out, we make a documentary, my brother and I, but that sets off in another 7 years of making documentaries for TG Ceathair. And what we set about with the idea was, TG Ceathair was founded in 1996. We made the first documentary, and their mission was Súil Ella, another eye. And so every year, my brother and I would go to the Middle East, or would go to China, or would go to South America, or would go to Greenland and make a program, always hunting out the minority peoples of that region, and to see what connection they have, how are they coping with bridging the modern world with their ancient customs, and what wisdom are they bringing from long ago. I did that for about, I suppose, 7 or 8 years, until my brother and I were fighting with each other so much during our trips that we felt we were going to be just at each other's throats. And I realized I needed to settle down. Like, by this stage, my granny had died and she had left me 5,000 euros, or 10,000 euros. And so I was able to buy land here in Westmeath. And then I was able to buy the house. The house I'm sitting in now is the second house I built on this land in 2002. First, I was able to build a straw house. And then I just sat there and thought, okay, I've seen all these things in the world and realized that so many of these, whether the Tarahumaran Indians who still run after their prey in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico, or the Nahi people of the Yunnan province in China, the matriarchal people, or the people of Lanyu Island in Taiwan, all of them had managed to keep connection with ancient stories of almost their origin stories, their native and geographical histories of their time, but also they kept the cultural otherworldly beliefs of their people. And suddenly, once I'm back in Ireland, I thought, why did I spend 7 years looking for that? We have the exact same thing in Ireland. We have kept our stories of the other world, of our rootedness to the land, of sustainable ways of growing all alive. And in fact, the way that it hit home most to me was on a day I was in Mullingar Library. It was a rainy day in Mullingar Library, and I had nothing to do. And my house, the little straw bale house I built here in the land in Westmeath, was so cold in winter days that I didn't want to go home. And I realized that you could go down and use the computers down the back. And there you could access the school's collection, the Bailúchan Skull from the 1930s. And all of these folklore collections that have been collected by every school master or school mistress in every parish. And I would just opened up the pages on Cummerstown and Collinstown, the places that I've now spent the last 22 years of my life. And every townland was talked about. So the people who were in school in 1938 and 39 were talking about how they would see the sort of fairy goddess rise up out of Loch Lane, or how the man on his way back from Fore to Cummerstown saw fairies sort of creating cheese and just playing some type of ancient ball game on the side of the road. And I thought, this isn't make-believe. This isn't stories for Americans or for, Disney with the likes of sort of Disney fairy stories. This is people saying what they actually said. They would say about which family, and they would name the family in their area that had managed to get gold from a leprechaun and what they'd done with the money. And the likes of the Fairy Daily, the great story that connected to the master sons in this area of Westmeath, the fairy who people saw, my neighbours saw the Fairy Daily on top of his thatch up at Whitehall. And I thought, all of this is alive. If I could capture this in a book, that would be something.
I love that. Fairies going about their ordinary business, making cheese and doing their accounting and dealing in money, being part of ordinary life. Just coming back to Westmeath, so your Sheila left you 10 grand, you bought 10 acres, you moved into the Midlands and you started planting all of these trees. So I'm really curious what it was like to make that transition from these travels into the Midlands, and what planting trees and living alongside these trees has taught you as well.
Yeah, so to get to the root of that, we need to, I suppose, because of being brought up in this odd hothouse where my grandmother just saw that somehow we were foot soldiers of the O'Reilly's regime from 1916, and we only had, despite being brought up in Donnybrook, we were only able to speak Irish in the house, and so we'd spend as much of our time down in West Kerry among Blasket Islanders. So I had these qualms, and meanwhile my grandmother would be in touch with hunger strikers up in Northern Ireland, and would be asking me to write these little Rizla letters, these columns back and forth to the prisoners. So I had all of that political turmoil, and my grandmother was so immersed in what was happening in the Troubles in the 1980s in Northern Ireland. And the other part of me was this dreamy part that always loved trees and herbs in the ground. So I wanted to find my own way, some way in the world that would make sense to me, which is why I traveled. But of course, the minute you travel, you're just escaping from yourself. You're not coming to terms with the truth. So luckily, as I said, I was advised to go to India, and India is a place that does make you finally turn inwards. And it was very clear, the only time you're going to make sense of who you are in this world is to go back to doing what you were doing when you were 5 and 6 and 7, growing vegetables in your back garden, growing herbs. That made sense of me, and letting my imagination run riot. So that's why I came back, bought the land. Luckily, the people in Collinstown, like Billy Connell and all, were so good to me and just looked after me, because I was this frail sort of innocent. And then I decided to combat the sort of turmoil in my brain. I realized that if I just planted trees, all would go well. And I had the 10 acres, so every day I would either dig up trees in the bog in Drumcree or in Cool and bring them back here, or otherwise I would buy trees from Future Forest. And I think the first thing I did was 40 fruit trees, and that made sense to me. I was rooting myself into something. Like I would find old dudines, the old clay pipes that I talk about in the book, were considered, again, even a generation ago, to be fairy pipes. I'd find these white clay pipes from the 1870s and 1890s, and I would find old plow equipment from, you know, the 19th and maybe 18th century, and I realized I am now rooting myself to something timeless, and I healed. The world made sense to me then, so I owe a lot to Westmeath.
And you know, I'm often kind of wary of that word healing, especially when we talk about poetry and language and books. But everything you're saying there is, I think it's a great thought to be reflecting on at the moment, in this moment of stillness and connection, and kind of healing our way through this moment just into some kind of transformation in the future on the other side of this pandemic. Just staying there with the trees for a moment, and thinking of trees in terms of language. One of the aspects of the Irish language that often gets a lot of airtime is the Ogham script, also known as the tree alphabet, and often which was written on bark and stone. And I myself quite like this idea that language is literally in our nature, and nature in our language. And similarly, another thing that you often hear bandied about is the fact that there is no verb for to have in the Irish language. So I had mentioned these things to you previously, and you said such an important thing, and it's really kind of stayed on my mind, which is that these aspects of the Irish language can be over romanticized. And perhaps you might speak further about the ways in which you think it's problematic to romanticize the Irish language, or to think of it, for example, as a revolutionary act. So maybe you might comment a bit further on that.
Yeah, I'd say some people would be like spitting their tea out of their mouth if I'm daring to say that one shouldn't romanticize the language, because what else is 32 words for a book than a blatant attempt to soft focus the harsh reality that the language is being lost to such a great degree, and the economic changes that are happening in Gaeltacht that are managing to make the language suffer, and the fact that the government isn't, you know, is not really promoting the language as it should. I mention none of that in the book because I think there are more interesting things. And what I do try and do, to be fair, is to bring in all of these spiritual elements and these romantic elements and these nature elements. I think my point is that there are 2 points. The reason I wrote the book is because we say the same things about the language the whole time. And you know, there were always criticisms. Either it was taught badly in school, the government fails to do it, it's no use in the modern world. It really is those 3 elements that are repeated. But then when we want to say positive things about the language, we often say, well, yeah, as you say, it doesn't have ownership, it doesn't have a possessive case. It is like Tá slide on Urim, or Tá agla Urim, the fear or the cold is on me rather than I have it. And that's true, but it is really it's just a grammatical construction that's found in a few other languages. It's not found in the main languages of Europe. So we think that the fact that we are not possessing the thing, but we're just saying we are in connection with them at the time, has resonance. And it does, but I think it's often overemphasized because it is really just an accident of grammar that has been adopted by a few of the early Indo-European languages, but was dropped by the others. And the concept of Ogham or Ogham, again, as you said, these signs on a stone. Again, in the 12th or maybe the 14th century, someone rewrote a concept that there might have been, that there were particular ways of writing the Ogham letters. And the Ogham letters, as we know, they're 2 lines on a stone. Probably before that, they would have been 1 or 2 lines on a piece of wood, and then etchings, just notches marked out of it, which were symbols of letters. And so people, I can't remember, is it the 16th century, but there was poetry written saying that it had a romantic element, and each Ogham tree was each Ogham sign was connected to a tree. But we have no proof of that. All we know is that in the countryside, there are boulders, there are menhirs, there are gollam, there are standing stones, and they are in Ireland, but they're also throughout Scotland, throughout Britain, throughout Galicia, and the whole of Western Spain, Western France, and even Northern Morocco has standing stones. And they're most likely, they were just landmarkers. They were possession stones. So, you know, I have a project at the moment called Sea Tamagotchi, where I go and collect sea coastal words. And I was up in Donegal, I know it was Mayo actually, and someone said to me, oh, seo clocha mark. It's just marking stones. So everybody, as we know, in Donegal particularly, on the coast, had a share of the seaweed, and they had stones marking where their shares were. And so the whole of Ireland, and even you go into the middle of the Sahara Desert, the whole of the Sahara Desert, if you find a tree there, an oasis, there are markings there to show which Bedouin tribe are connected to that. So all over the world, there were standing stones. And then to show who was getting that land, like the person who erected the standing stone, everybody knew it was his land, his domain. But then when he died, to show who was taking it over, they would have had to etch the person's name in. And this was done relatively modern, because the Ogham alphabet is based on the Latin alphabet. So it is, no older than, it's a Roman-based Latin alphabet. So we can't say that it goes back into the mists of time or it's romantic. I mean, you could guess that maybe it had been that, and then the use was forgotten, and then it was connected to the Latin alphabet. But most likely, it's a 2,000-year-old construction used to show possession. I own this, you don't own that. So that's why when people get very romantic about the Ogham language, I try and remind them really it's just a practical tool for branding.
I love that language being a lived everyday thing, and that by making it romantic or mythologizing, we're allocating it to some other sphere. And one of the strengths of your books is that it's mystical, but it's not sentimental. It's also very lived. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my own practice, Manchán, is to encourage people to read and engage with Irish language poetry voices. Because in addition to other gifts, Irish language poetry I feel it's got something to say to the subject of ecology and care for the environment, and about the physical body, the human body as an extension of the landscape. And that's to be seen right from Magan, said to be the first poet who wrote down text, who said, "Am gich yn muir, am ton trehan, am fuam yn muir, am de shetar. I'm wind on sea, I am wave on land, I'm ocean roar, I am a stag of 7 fights." So that blurring of the body and the landscape, it continues right up to the present moment, when with poets like Nuala O'Neill, who writes in Ilan is the harp alair in the Maramaya, your body is an island in the great ocean. And Nuala has said in an interview that poetry is a plumb line into the subconscious life. And I'd go on further and say that Irish language poetry is almost a deeper plumb line. And so I'd love to know about how you've experienced Irish language poetry, and whether you think it occupies a special place in our culture.
Yeah. First, so you remember when I was saying with the criticism of Irish, and one of the main ones, it says no role in the modern world. I suppose the reason people say that, it's not practical, it's not technical, it's not efficient in the way that German or a modern or an English like English is. These languages that came around only in the last millennium or two. These ancient languages that and Irish is in no way special. It's the same as like Sanskrit or Hebrew or Mandarin, any of the really ancient languages that go right back to the roots, see the world in a very different way, in a way that is absolutely connected to the seasons, to the landscape, to the soil. And that's why I have long lists in my book of different words for like a hole or a tree or a park. So like a plubán, a hole made by the hooves of animals and then filled with rain, or a fach, a hole that lobsters hide in, or a push, a hole that hides a wild beast. So you're going to, in some ways, yes, Irish is not as efficient as the modern world, but if you want to connect with the land and nature and the seasons, you're not going to find a better medium than one of the really ancient languages. And as I said, Irish is truly one of those. So the minute you have that in your disposal, it means your poetry is going to get way deeper, because it's going to be grown out of the sand, out of the rock, out of the soil. Not only that, but all of the mythology and Irish is so much based on its proverbs, its seanchal, and its allusions to old mythologies. So in the book, I talk about Town Cliana, the wave of Cliana. Cliana was not only a wave, or not only a sea wave, a sound wave, a vibrational wave. She was also she was also a load of other things, which I can't remember now. But she, she's like a metaphor for saying that the stormy weather coming on. So in Cork, you'll say, Tá cliana ann, there's stormy weather, bad weather is coming in. So when the words, like a poet tries to have those resonances, good poetry tries to have those resonances in its writing. Conversational speech in modern languages does not. But Irish, by dint of the fact that all of the words and the phrases, the seanachal and the metaphors, are connected to old myths, are connected to otherworldly beliefs. I talk about, she guiha, the gust of wind. And she can mean a gust, but it also means a fairy. So in the mind of Irish people long ago, they'd see a gust, they'd see the wind blowing and they imagine the fairies were there. And so they would call it that. So you have this language that is on myriad different levels, is tripping different concepts in different minds. And at the moment, I'm sitting here in my house, just behind that white wall, writing my second book. In fact, my third book, my second book I wrote last month. It was a book for children, a book of gorgeous words for children, the last 2 months. The book I'm writing now is about the insights we get from landscape. And this morning, I was writing about rivers in Ireland and how rivers are all embodied goddesses, at least the great rivers are. So the Ban River, Ban means Bondia, goddess. The Boyne River, I write in 32 words, is the goddess who was married to the Dagda and forms herself into the river. And then, the Shannon is obviously the river, the goddess Shannon. So literally the physical elements there, and some of the great myths and poets talk about how their limbs, their thighs, their head are different parts of the water. We cannot look at nature without thinking of it in a physical form and without thinking of all of those resonances of past beliefs that go with it. So it's by nature very poetic.
Mm. And one of the things that I'm often saying in my workshops is that we shouldn't reduce the Irish language to mere words. And your book captures this idea perfectly, that the Irish language is a language in which we read, we listen, we dream, we think, we intuit, and we know things in Irish that we have frustratingly sometimes yet to work out in English. And I think about that every time a national debate or a national discussion occurs. I was thinking about it during the marriage equality campaign when people were talking about different family types and different structures. And I was thinking, in the Irish language, we know about diversity, we know about inclusivity, and we're having to educate ourselves all over again in this second language. And I wonder, do you sometimes feel that frustration as well?
I do. I feel this yearning for us to connect what is inside the Irish language, even if we didn't do it through the Irish language. The Irish language happens to be a pretty practical way to do it once we got over the psychological trauma. And like we could talk, all of us in Ireland have such trauma connected to the language. And either it's going back to the famine, where our parents and our grandparents after the famine, survivors, told the children, you need to learn English for your own survival. It's breaking my heart, but you cannot say a word of Irish because you will not have a chance beyond here, and this land will not feed you anymore. It is polluted. It is just as polluted as today with climate change. They would put food in the ground and they would rot. They did not know why. It would just kill the food. They had to get out, and for that they had to kill the Irish language. So that would make for a good reason why in our epigenetics of our soul, we know, turn your back on this language. It has starved you once. It has killed all your ancestors. It could do so again. But then we have the more recent problems with how it was taught in school and how it has been politicized in Northern Ireland and down here. So there were all of those elements that we need to get over. But then if we can get beyond those, then what I think that the most valuable thing the language can give us is showing us that there are worlds beyond our rational world. And that's a big challenge, and it's maybe a dangerous journey to go through. But like from the beginning of time, humans have needed a spiritual outlet. They have needed to feel connected to something bigger and grander. And without doing it, you have psychological issues and maybe psychological breakdown. You have a huge increase in trauma. We need a greater power, a God, another worldly being. Just it's hardwired into some element, some complex element of our DNA to have this, the mystery, the magic. Now, the Catholic Church, and before that, the Christian Church served us more or less, either well or badly, depending on the era, from the 5th century onwards, that's sort of crumbling, you know, it's for a lot of people. That is no longer the buttress, the fortress that they had. So we need something. We need desperately something, because times are changing and getting more challenging. We just need to find meaning in our lives. And I believe that we can take on the yoga mat and we can take on some Buddhism from another part of the world. But when we have this belief in Ireland that is actually far stronger than Christianity, this pagan belief that there was a God in the seasons, that there was a God in every leaf bud, in every raindrop, in every pebble, in every fish that you catch from the sea, and that you can work with all of these animals and insects and flora in a respectful way, then how beautiful would it be to take on? Now, I would have said that was an impossibility when I was running for the election and thinking people just want to know about grants, about jobs, about the future. But since COVID, we're realizing we need to reimagine everything about how we live as families, how we exist in the world. And we feel this yearning inside of us for something more deep, with more meaning. And maybe the Irish language might have a role in helping to support that.
I'd echo that. I've never felt more hopeful for the Irish language during this time of COVID and lockdown. I'm just hearing from everyone the need to make new rituals, or to reconnect with the older pre-Christian rituals, and to find the meaning in the everyday, and to kind of meditate on the plant or the flower in front of you, or the back garden that you're nourishing during this time. So it makes me feel very heartened actually about the rejuvenated interest in the Irish language. And you mentioned there trauma, and you know there's such a fear in us, or a fear has been cultivated in Ireland about owning up to the fact that you do know more Irish than you say you do. I mean, the amount of people who are very quick to say, oh, I don't have any Irish, I don't speak any Irish. And yet you're living in Ireland, you're seeing, you hear Irish place names all the time, you hear Irish on the loose, you hear Irish on the buses, you're able to receive an Irish instruction and understand it. And if the average person had the amount of Irish that they do have, if they had the amount of French or German that they do have Irish, they'd be saying, I speak basic French or German. So I feel very heartened that awareness is going to increase in people, that they do have the language within them. And I love that idea that languages are remembered as well, and that they're not necessarily learned, but they're kind of floating around there inside us, waiting to be accessed. Listen, one of my favorite parts of the book, and there's so many chapters that I went back to, was the chapter on the Cailleach and how to recognize the Cailleach. And I'm conscious that there might be people here on the Zoom who don't know about the Cailleach, and I wondered if you would speak a little bit about our relevance and importance in our heritage.
Yes. So, I mean, what you were saying there has such fascinating things to say too, but I shall go on to the Cailleach. The Cailleach. So, and talk about me romanticizing words. The Cailleach. Caille means a veil. Okay. So Cailleach is a veiled figure. And so that's why nuns can be called Cailleach. But it seems to have, if you just take the simple word, it's not very interesting. It's a woman. It's a woman with a veil on her head, and tend to be an old woman because old people veils. But it's so much more than that. It is a nature goddess. It is a female deity in the landscape that represents the same as almost what Durga, or some traits of what Kali does in Hindu culture. She is the destructive, powerful goddess that brings in winter. So she's basically the witch on her broom, like where we get the modern day witch now. Cailleach is a hag or a veiled figure, but it also has the idea of a witch. So where the witch rides around on her broom, bringing turmoil and chaos wherever she goes. So what the Cailleach does, it's both more, this tradition is probably now stronger remembered in Scotland than it is here, but she sails through the land and bringing winter with her, beating her with her cudgel, the land and the trees and the leaves, to beat them all back so that winter comes. And then she is the same figure as Bridget in the 1st of February. So you have this ancient woman who gets older and older every single day of winter, and you can see the leaves die back and the trees wilt and everything go into hibernation. And that is the Cailleach slowly, gradually dying until the 1st of February. Overnight, she becomes Bridget. She becomes the maiden, the young fertile, vibrant young girl. And the beauty about everything in really old societies is this is never it's never 0-1. It's never one thing or the other. It's always yes and. So Cailleach, the ancient woman who brings in winter, is the same person who switches overnight and becomes Bridget, who brings in the spring. So there's almost nothing that you can't throw in the pot of Cailleach and she becomes. She's our connector with the land, with the female mother goddess, and particularly in the Midlands, where we have, as you know, we have Loughcrew just in Meath, we have which is Sliabh na Cailleach, the hill of the Cailleach, of the great woman, created by when she dropped stones from her apron down and created these cairns on top of the mountain. And of course, what is that? That is a mythic story of the geological formation of these places. When the glaciers swept through the land, deposited huge amounts of boulders, of drumlins. Like here on my land in Westmeath, I'm sitting on top of a drumlin deposited by a glacier. But of course, how were people to experience and express that long ago when they would see these stones that weren't in the area? They were from another area, but they were suddenly in their area. It was obviously the Cailleach who had brought them up and deposited them. So it's not simplicity, it's not a myth. It was a sophisticated way of communicating an ancient thought about something that they somehow had intuited or maybe remembered from 10,000 years ago when their first ancestors were coming and the water of the ice sheet was still washing off the land. So all of that within one word. But just the final thing, because we're in Westmeath, we have Loughcrew on, beside me on the border over in Old Castle in Meath, but then we have the Hill of Uisneach. And so we are in Midda, Meath, Westmeath, Ear, Midda. And what is Midda? Midda is the middle place. Remember, there were 5 provinces in Ireland. It was all connected in the Midda, the Hill of Uisneach, in between Athlone and Mullingar. And if we got a sense of what Midda, or of what Uisneach totally understood, it would change our whole perspective of where we are in the world. Because Midda it's the connections point, the interconnected point of all of the world. So in Hindu culture, and I can explain why we have the exact same belief systems as Hindu culture, because we were the same people with the same language at one time. So whereas the Brahmin and the Hindu culture had this axis, this tree of life, an axis mundi, a center point of which everything around which everything else revolves. We in Ireland have the same thing, and our center is Westmeath, is the Hill of Uisneach. And that is where not only are the center of every energy, of every season, of every cycle in Ireland, but of all of the different layers, all the different quantum layers that quantum physics are now understanding, the different dimensions that always existed in the Irish mindset of both reality and then the other world, the worlds that were osnaldort, beyond reality. All of that is centered in Westmeath. And we here in Westmeath and the Midlands in general are the guardians of this potent place of transformation. And as I said, you could look at it through a geographical point of view or a geological or a linguistic point of view. But the point is, or the fairy stories, they all point to here. This is the center point of Bealtaine, the rebirth of the land of the seasons. And it's up to us as individuals, as Irish people, particularly as Midlanders, to take on that energy again and hold it in the same way as native people are doing all over the world.
If I was to go back to the beginning of lockdown and the travel restrictions and my thoughts at that time, I was thinking, I can't wait to go to London. I really want to go back to Paris. I was so frustrated with the travel restrictions and not being able to go anywhere. And as time ticks on, the first place I want to go to is back to Uisneach. It's such a special piece of the landscape, and it just seems to resonate and breathe with all that heritage. Am I right in saying that that's where the High Kings used to meet as well and to make decisions? So to anyone listening who hasn't been to the Hill of Uisneach, it's just a spectacular place to go and kind of reconnect, and a great place to kind of restart your journey or to nourish your journey with the Irish language. Could I ask you, maybe, I think we have a little bit of time, and it would be lovely to hear a little bit from the book, Manchán, if you are so willing to share some words with us.
Yeah. So I'll read you from a chapter in the middle called Place Names. And this is this book has been out since September, but this is only my 3rd ever time reading. For some reason, because of COVID, you don't turn up in bookshops and you don't read. So I'm still learning. and each time I'm picking a different bit. So place names. The most direct and visceral way the Irish language is connected to landscape is through place names. While the local names for fields, hills, hollows, rocks, cliffs, trails, and summits are enriching, it's the names of the 60,000 townlands that truly reveal the world around us. Many of them are like koans, paradoxical riddles without a clear solution. They offer tantalizing hints and encoded reflections on our culture, on our psyche, and our past practice that are becoming gradually less decipherable every year. There are glimpses into the historical, geographical, and anecdotal qualities of our past, just waiting to be revealed by those who understand the code. And now, with online resources, all of us can. With a little patience, we can begin to unpack them, just as one might unpack the pellet of a barn owl, to reveal the husks, hairs, and bone fragments within. By seeing beyond the archaic terminology and rare grammatical constructions, we can get tantalizing insights into our ancestral lives, their knowledge of environments, and their folk beliefs. Like in its anglicised form, the form Béal na Briscán in County Mayo means nothing. But Béal Áha na Mriscán means the settlement of the ford of the wild tansy. Suddenly, an unassuming spot on a back road from Cong to Claremorris becomes a meadow rich with flat-topped yellow flowers, smelling of camphor and rosemary. Images of the annual gathering of tansy that would have taken place here over centuries or even millennia are conjured up, with local people harvesting the plants to use them throughout the year as a cure for joint pain and as a wrapping for meat, since its toxic compounds repel insects and maggots. A place like Béal na Briscán would have received more covert night visits by women in distress, as tansy has long been used to induce miscarriages when taken in high doses. Just south of the village in Adair in County Limerick is Knockfearna, which was Cnochrin Irna, Down's Hill of Truth, or Don's Hill of Truth. The name sparks curiosity, and further burrowing reveals that this was the power centre of Don, a brother of Amergin, who we referred to earlier, who the first druid in Ireland, the druid whose incantation propelled our world into being. He was therefore also an uncle of Conall Cernach, who responded to the anguish wails of the Shield O'Chun, but we won't get into that here. It's said that Donn drowned with the rest of Amergin's family, trying to reach the coastline, but was later resurrected as king of the Munster fairies. Like, I love it. It's just like how the Cailleach goes from being the witch to the young maiden. You take any of these strands of stories and they just go round and round in coils, but we'll try and keep to the issue. He chose Knockfearna for the site of his palace, from where he ruled over the rolling meadows of County Limerick, and he buried there into a massive rock cairn on the summit. Local people will tell you that truth, Fearna, referred to in the place name, concerns the accurate weather predictions that certain residents of the area claim to make by gauging the appearance of the hill. But in fact, it's connected to the deeper and more serious truth of life and death, represented by Dunn's other persona, King of the Dead. The sight of his white horses galloping by on a stormy night meant that you were about to face the ultimate truth of your mortality. Anyway, it goes on and on like that with more words and place names. Can I ask you a quick question, Annemarie, to get your opinion on something? Sometimes I say in public lectures, and it was a poet who took me short and said, this is absolutely wrong. So when I ran for the Green Party, I had to think about, we're thinking of sustainability, issues of sustainability, and also we're thinking in terms of language. But I remember I gave a long talk to the Green Party once about how vital it was, to reassess our way with the landscape. And then someone said to me, what about the Irish language? And when I compared those two, the landscape was so much more important and primal to me. And I went as far as I said, look, actually, language is not a great medium, I said. And I imagine you're going to attack me now, but I think dance and music, and there are some, I find it frustrating and difficult to communicate through words. That's why it took 6 years to write this book. There's ideas in my head now that I would love to energetically and telepathically communicate to people, but I have to do it through this limited way of words, of language, of syntax, of grammar. And had I a musical ability, I think I could have bypassed people's mind and got to their soul. Likewise with art. Is it okay to say that writing and poetry is a lesser art?
Well, I can only speak to the experience of my personal experience of poetry, and I think of poetry as being primarily a pre-language instinct, and you know that also that urge to make a mark with your body or to make a sound out of your body is so it's just so important, you know. And so to me, poetry is much more than you know, the right word or word construction, but it's about some inherent impulse, and that often expresses itself in a bodily way through the urge to make a mark with a pen on paper or to make a sound coming out of you. So, I mean, you know, poetry and dance are not entirely unconnected. Like, poetry is not over here, or language is not over here doing its separate thing to dance or to music. I think of them all as interconnected. And sure, you're right, you know, language can be difficult. Like, language is thorny. It has, you know, the actual nuts and bolts of language have to be learned. But speaking to the idea of poetry, you know, it's about much more than just words or punctuation or the shape that a poem makes on the page. There's a greater concern there, and it's like poetry is the pursuit of mystery, and it's the pursuit of the mystical, and it's a great embracing of the unknown. So in many ways, it's all of these things that you speak about in the book as well. And I just think we get hung up in the education system with the idea that the poem is this constructed thing on the page, and that it's kind of all locked up and you have to get a key into it. And, you know, it becomes very difficult and daunting for people, and they get overwhelmed with what the right answer and the wrong interpretation of the poem is. And like, for me, I'm really interested in the way that poetry, you know, blurs the body, the human body, and the landscape. Poetry leads us to the things we don't know about ourselves, and poetry comes out of the body in movement and in sound. So I think both things are true, in that language is difficult, and yet it's no less important than any of the other things that we do with our physical selves either. So I'm imagining it was a poet who tackled you, or it was a creative writer that tackled you.
Yeah, you've done it beautifully, and I totally resign to that. Like, the human voice is one of the most profound things I know. And like, there's a great Inuit throat singer from Nunavut in Canada called Sandra Tagakilis, and she does this whale singing, and it just goes right to my soul. But so much words and so much sound, and if I want to ultimately express myself in the same way, when you're out, you know, when you're at have your limits down, when you're either freezing cold or you're drunk or something, you scream, you call, you win. Language, your voice is the most important. Anyway, I'm sorry, I hijacked this talk.
No, not at all. And I was just looking at the chat as you were reading there in the chat box, and somebody just said, "This is so emotional." And I think that really captures your book. And for me, being in your presence when you're talking about language, it makes me very emotional. It reminds me that there's more that I can be doing to nourish the language in my work and in myself and in the communities that I live in. I want to go quickly. There's so many questions coming in for you, Manchán, and time is just not going to allow us to get through all of them. But following on from your lovely reading, in which you had talked about place names, one of the questions coming in was around the use of sat-nav and air codes. And this questioner said, we read place names less frequently, and is that further diminishing our connection with the Irish language and landscape?
Mm-hmm. we can choose to read them more frequently. It was the artist Alice Maher who told me that she takes buses around Ireland, which again most of us should be doing, or even trains, and she just writes down the place names that she passes. Yes, you could say that air codes and sat navs are doing harm to place names, but all of the place names are there on, you know, clearer road markings than ever. You remember the 1970s and the 80s, the rusty old road markers. They are all there everywhere you go. You know, within a kilometre or two, you will find a road marker, and that road marker will have a name on it, and that name will be an encoded history and link into something really far past. So we can complain about with a few places that it's not anymore, but why would we when it is everywhere? We have these bilingual place names and place markers. Just to answer your thing about it being emotional and the book having a role, the book has had a role not because of anything to do with the book. As I said, the book, you know, the book sold out before people had read the book. We just happen to be at a time where people are naturally going back to things that have more meaning to them. It's a really exciting time. It's a very unstable time and uncertain time in the world. But the early 21st century, everything about how we existed for the last 150 years, or maybe since the Industrial Revolution, is being rethought. And as part of that, we are finding meaning and we are finding connection with nature. And it just happens that my book is one of the strands that's fitting into that. But we don't need to feel that we need to do any more. It's arising within us. We just need to allow it and to tap into it. And to recognize the hindrances, the fact that we will want to blame it on the government, or we will want to stop ourselves learning other cultures because we'll think it's unpractical. But if we open to our hearts and trust that things will come, you know, amazing things can happen.
That's such a striking thought, that rather than pushing and trying to control, that we should lean into the natural transformation that is happening right now around us and within us. And like the question that has come in different guises through Twitter and Facebook and in the chat box is just that, you know, how do we encourage a meaningful connection with the language for future generations? And also several people have asked in particular, what do we need to do anything in schools and educational settings?
Yeah. So again, you know, before this, I had a show called Iran, a Gazine, based on the ideas in the book. I bake bread, I bake sourdough bread, and the audience churned butter. And we did it in Castle Pollard and we did it in Delvin, and we still have to do it. I'll do it in Mullingar and Athlone as soon as this lockdown, probably be 2022. But it's a lovely show. And the first time I ever did it was for the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. And someone came up to me from the UCD School of Education. And he said, these ideas need to be in the educational system. And I get very moody and tired after a Ron Gazine show because it takes a lot of energy. And I said to him, look, I can't hear you now, because he was talking a lot to me about the education system. And I said, look, maybe email me. And he never emailed me. And I thought, oh, that's the end. I had one chance to get into the Department of Education and I failed, or into how they teach. Now, and then when the book came out, I thought, oh, it's going to take a year before anyone hears about the book. As we know, that didn't happen. It's, you know, it's fifth reprinting is happening in about 5 days' time. Everybody, I know so many people in the Department of Education have read this book. So many people at so many levels of government. Michael D. Higgins says people have read this book and all of them are talking about it. And not only that, this book is going to spark so many other books on the same, and plays and musical things. And already the amount of people who are collaborating with the book and doing new things with it. So this is going to take over our way of looking at old languages. We're going to stop seeing the Irish as a political tool or as an educational thing, and as a wonder sphere to break through barriers. And as part of that, there will inevitably have changes will happen in government, in the Department of Education. We need to be a bit patient and allow it to happen. But we as a people are now more mature. We are willing to take on this lore, this gem we have brought down to ourselves, and we're going to do magic things with it. And so our government will reflect that, I believe.
And maybe an extension of some of the points that you made there, in the chat box, somebody has described the way that the landscape looks today from her perspective, dotted with bungalows and private plots, and you know, has described it as being not sustainable. So how do we move forward and reconcile ourselves with, you know, this kind of idea of making progress whilst also becoming sustainable?
So we are in a very, challenging time, a time of absolute change and transformation, and it's only the beginning of it. So for the moment, you have farmers, good Westmeath farmers and Midland farmers, who are investing, $500,000 in a milking parlour because that's the way they see the future. And yet all of us know that that type of industrial farming that has been so good to this country, to this world for the last 50, 60 years is coming to an end. We know that it has exhausted the soil, we know that it's polluted the rivers, and we know it cannot continue. So clearly there's so much money tied up in it that's going to be a long fight. But with the new common agricultural policy from the EU, it's had a 2-year pause, but the grants are only going to go towards sustainable farming. That's inevitable for the future. So that big type of industrial farming is going to come to an end. And with it, we're going to have to find new ways of feeding ourselves sustainably on the land, ways that do not damage the land, that are actually benefiting the soil, capturing carbon in the soil, and doing it in a sustainable way. And it means if the great male god, the male sort of prowess symbol of the tractor is no longer there, is no longer the key, you have a more slow, sustainable farm that unfortunately requires more work, more physical work. But we're not saying in any way we're going back to the hardship of the past. We're just going back towards in the same way as during COVID, so many people started growing seeds and growing vegetables just a little bit in their back garden. And they realized 2 things. First, it's very easy. Second, they realized 3 things. Second, you get a bountiful supply from a tiny amount of work. And 3, the psychological aspect, the healing aspect of growing food is profound. Again, allow these tiny changes to seed in the community and just see where they're going to go. Without sustained money, grants coming for unfeasible, unsustainable farming from the EU, with the big industry and eventually the big governments making commitments to zero carbon, that old way of exploiting our land is coming to an end. So naturally, we are going to be moving towards ways of connecting with the land in a more easier way. It will, as I say, require a bit more work. It will require less massive profits for multinationals, but it's going to enrich our lives, I believe.
What a gift to speak to you, Manchán, and words that you've used there: healing, being present, leaning into transformation, the idea of something that hasn't been healthy for us coming to an end, and reconnecting now with what we know to be true about language and landscape. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and for being so generous with your insights. It's absolutely illuminating. It's a ray of hope as well in these times. Listen, I want to thank the Westmeath Arts Office and libraries, and say a particular thank you to Miriam, who has set up this event with Manchán. I want to encourage you all to buy a copy of this book, and actually buy 2 copies. Consider gifting this to somebody who needs some nourishment and reconnection in their lives, or it's a beautiful gift book. I sent this to friends in the States, and it's a little piece of Ireland, and it's a little piece of light and hope to give to someone. So the book is going to be, so am I right in saying that the book is going to be back in print within a week? And so if it is not already available in Westmeath bookshops, Just Books, Mullingar, and sorry, what's the name of the other bookshop in Westmeath where it's?
In Ford, there's a coffee shop in the village of Ford, and Jane there in the coffee shop always has a few signed copies for sale.
So if it's not there, it's going to be there within a week. And it's also, of course, available in all good bookshops nationwide as well. So it's published by Gill Books, and long may it sell, and long may it spread light throughout the world, Manchán. And thank you very much. Gura míle maigad.
Gura míle maigad. So that was such a pleasure. Thank you, Annemarie.
Thank you to everyone for listening. And maybe we'll wrap it up there. Gura míle maigad.